All right, welcome everybody. It's January 10th. It is the NAMSP annual meeting, so many of us are out here in San Diego. But the show must go on, and this one is going to be very important for many of us. How did this come about? Kolby Miller is someone that I've gotten to meet over the years. Recently was up in Michigan, and we got to have dinner with him and his team. But then he put a post up on LinkedIn, which I'm sure he'll get into, where he talks about where in 2012, where he was telling people that response times aren't all that he was mocked. And fast forward many years, and it turns out he's right. And I said, hey, Kolby, but I'd love to have you come on the webinar and talk about this exact topic. So Kolby is the CEO of MedStar of Michigan. He's been a paramedic, been in the field, has done it all, and now he's an executive and he's an administrator up in Michigan. So, without any further ado, Kolby, thanks for joining us, and I'm very looking forward to your talk.
Thanks,
Take it
Peter.
away.
Happy to be here. Happy to have the conversation wherever we can. As you said, a little background on me, paramedic, worked in public and private and now not-for-profit EMS since the late 80s. I'm sure everybody can figure the math out on that one. It's probably time to be on a sailboat somewhere, but yet here I am. Fortunate to lead the largest EMS provider in Michigan now, MedStar. We have about 900 employees in 11 counties serving just under 200,000 patients a year through the ground and an air medical program. I've worked a little bit with our ambulance association here in the state, a couple terms as the president, and I'm currently the chair of the state EMS safety committee as a subcommittee of the state EMS CC steering committee. Safety committee was an ad hoc committee until 2024. We started to put a lot of effort into some of our safety practices, and the state made it a standing committee. As Peter said, as a paramedic, it started to occur to me pretty early into my career that some of the stuff we were hustling around town for just didn't need the hustle. And as I grew in my organizational responsibilities and some of the system roles that I had, I began to notice that the only metric we reported on, or the only discussion that we really had about our performance, and sometimes from a competitive perspective, different agency types would step to the mic and kind of beat their chest, and the only thing they'd really talk about is response times. And it started to occur to me, and I'm not a scientist, I'm not a researcher, I'm an ambulance guy. It started to occur to me that we're spending a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of risk, and a lot of unnecessary time and effort discussing a metric that really doesn't seem to affect most of the patients we respond to. And in the ones where it does, we might actually be working against ourselves by designing our system to meet everybody's need in the same time frame. The first presentation was at the Zoll Summit Conference in, I think it was 2009. Half the room left, got up and left. Presented at an American Ambulance Association conference. There were some people from varying departments there, different agency types, and almost type by type, some of the attendees got up and left. Some pretty loudly, threatening, indicating that we were going to be killing people if we didn't respond, red lights and siren with 7 vehicles to every request. So as my role at MedStar and my engagement in the Michigan EMS system has developed, I kind of took on a little bit of a personal mission here to at least start the discussion. And I thought it was important to include all of the EMS stakeholders rather than what I saw as the EMS agency leaders going back to all of their stakeholders and telling the story about how an EMS system works. I kind of thought the story was being told with a little bit of a self-serving bend. And again, I'm a paramedic. I've told the story myself. I've not, I'm not exempt from thinking that what we've always done is always the right thing. In my presentation, I always start with a slide that has a picture of a KED board, an EOA airway, a jaw screw, and a demand valve resuscitator, and a backboard. And I point out that when the data showed us that these things weren't valuable anymore, we got rid of them off our ambulances faster than you can say 7-Eleven or lunch. But when the data shows that response times and the system structure built around response times might not be all that, we've got 101 excuses to not make changes. And it's funny how the things that physically affect us that we kind of don't like, we get rid of really quick. The things that enable us sometimes and that we've always used as the foundation of our value proposition or how we report on our good work, when the data and the research and the sometimes obvious information works against that belief, there's a lot of us don't want to talk about it. So my effort was to bring people together. MedStar as the sponsor. We looked for a little bit of sponsorship from some of our vendors, but we shouldered most of it. And when the paper came out in 2022 from Dr. Kupas, this is the presenter lineup for the third annual summit that we're going to talk about in a bit, but I'll walk through the history of these summits. In 2022, when the first joint position paper came out from Dr. Kupas and all of the other EMS system stakeholders across the country, we decided to hold this EMS Safety and System Design Summit immediately on the heels of the paper being released. And we introduced the concept that red lights and siren were dangerous. Multiple vehicles responding red lights and siren were dangerous. The belief that we've always held in our systems that everything is an emergency, everything has to be responded to with multiple vehicles and lights and siren was more, the juice was not worth the squeeze. And Dr. Kupas does a great job presenting data on the risk associated with the red lights and siren responses, as well as the clinical outcome and the clinical data about the patients that we're serving. Jerry Overton presented at that conference, and we talked about how dispatch could play a key role in helping us sort the right vehicles, the right personnel, the right level of response to the right patient. And kind of started the idea that maybe we think we're doing something that's good, but we might be costing our systems a lot of money, not benefiting the patients. We might be working against some of our patients in this everybody has to have the same thing model. And most importantly, we're putting our personnel and the public that we're supposed to be serving at risk while we run this apparatus and EMS vehicles all over town, lights and siren. In the first session in 2022, there were 40 attendees. It was a one-day conference. We held it at the Detroit Athletic Club, gave everybody lunch, good representation of emergency medicine physicians, EMS system leaders, agency folks, elected and appointed people, mayors and supervisors and city managers, and then administrators from some of our health systems. So a good cross-section of the EMS stakeholder group. And we presented, Dr. Kramer recently retired from Washington at the time, talked about system design. His history is here in Michigan. Dr. Fales is the state EMS medical director. Dr. Kupas reported on the paper. Jerry talked about the ability of proper emergency medical dispatch to make a difference. And Matt Zavatsky from MedStar in Fort Worth talked about EMS systems around the country that weren't doing what everybody thought we're always supposed to be doing, running lights and siren to everything. Interestingly, there was a lot of good feedback after the meeting, immediately after the meeting, standing around the room. It was an hour and a half after the meeting ended that the attendees left because the conversations were so robust. And it's an interesting breakdown, and I point the breakdown out because with each with each passing summit, we see some of the same comments. The health systems and the docs in the room said, this makes sense to us. We didn't know that you responded to every patient, lights and siren, as if they were all the highest acuity. The elected officials in the room said, wow, this is really interesting. We've been told by our EMS leaders and our public safety leaders that everything you do is life-threatening and response times are critical on all these calls. And this is really surprising that lights and siren are risky. We don't gain that much time anyway. And the time that we do gain doesn't matter to 98% of the patients. The EMS and fire people in the room kind of said, well, this data is really interesting. And we recognize that there's some smart people in the study, but this is the way we've always done it. And the public expects it. And then the unending stories of what if and what about and these odd one-offs that everybody wants to talk about. And it was very interesting to me to see it was almost like a political divide between the groups of attendees and how they separated after the information was presented and how they kind of internalized it. A year later, we got everybody together and we said, all right, it's been a year. Now we invited the same general group. Some of the same people attended. We had some different attendees from different organizations, and it grew from 40 to 60 in the second year. As we brought the second year together, we talked more about the changes that were taking place around the country in different response models, agencies going away from red lights and siren, agencies going very public with their local electeds saying that, this response time thing is a crushing burden to our EMS system that might not be benefiting all of our patients, and kind of bringing the Michigan group up to speed that what we talked about a year ago is now starting to gain traction in EMS agencies and systems around the country. Dr. Kupus updated us on the feedback that he'd gotten through the various organizations since the paper was first published. Matt presented again on, the other agencies around the country. And we started this theme, the topic or the concept that we introduced in the second meeting was, if we think that lights and siren and response time to every patient matters, we're fooling ourselves and we're putting people at risk in disbelief. And we've got to take account for the fact that the public does trust us almost, without hesitation. And we've got to take ownership of the material that we're presenting and the beliefs that we're presenting, especially in light of the fact that the data is piling up, that what we've long thought might not be relevant to every patient. I'll always put the caveat in that there are a few patients in our system where time matters, but to those patients where time does matter, the impact of trying to get to everybody else within a certain amount of time actually causes delays for the ones who really do need it. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. Almost the same presenters, the mix of the people in the room are about the same. And then the meeting breaks up. It's another full day meeting, good lunch. We might have had some cocktails and cigars the night before. There were a lot of people that came in early for some social time the evening before. The day goes, the presentations are good, and the health system folks and the EMS physicians that were there said, wow, this is essentially the same information we talked about last year. It's a nice update from what's going on around the country, but what have we done locally since we gained all this information? And there were some blank stares. The elected and appointed officials pretty much had the same response. This is interesting. The only data we ever hear about from our EMS and public safety people is response times. It's in the second year that the elected and appointed start to put together the expense of their EMS system and tie it to this commitment to response times. And they start to realize this costs us a lot of money to deliver this level of care to every single patient every time they call 911, based only on the fact that they know how to dial a phone and not their level of acuity. They also picked up that the other states around us were making changes, and Michigan, we seem to just be holding an annual conference to talk about what everybody else is doing. Unfortunately, my colleagues in the room, the fire and EMS guys, said the same thing we said the year before. We know the studies out there, we know the data. There's other systems that are making big changes, and they all sound really cool, but really, this is what we've always done. The public expects it. I've got a couple of off the cuff jokes that I use about that. The public expects us to defibrillate every heart attack patient too. Thankfully, we don't. But this public expectation thing, driven by us, by the way, keeps coming up as a reason. And then my colleagues, the EMS and fire and public safety people, start to come up with, sometimes dispatch is wrong, or this one time the caller didn't know, and this one time that when we're presenting national data and we're talking about patient outcomes in the aggregate, and we're looking at tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of responses, we don't do ourselves any good to start talking about this one time. It was tough to be in the group that really hadn't moved the needle any since the last time we got together. The third summit was November of this past year. This is where Dr. Antebi picked up on the conversation. And it was put together shortly after we knew the position paper was coming out. So we timed We timed the summit around the release of the second position paper. But this summit was timed around the release of the position paper about EMS system performance beyond response times. And now we're presenting data to the same subgroup, again, different attendees, but representing the same stakeholders. We're presenting data about there are other ways to measure the performance of your EMS system. And while response time might be a component, it should not be the leading component, and it should be recognized as if it's going to be a component, it should not be associated with patient outcomes or the assumption that automatically time equals an outcome change. There was a lot more data about response times and patient outcomes presented from Dr. Kupas. Dr. Bronsky joined us. Dr. Daya from Washington joined. More physicians talking about more EMS systems around the country, talking about RFPs going out for response or for EMS systems, talking about some public safety agencies, Colorado Springs being a great example, implementing changes in their systems to move away from this idea that everybody's got to have a 6-minute red lights and siren response from 4 different vehicles. And really hammering the point that we're talking about science, research, data, real measurable impact in a way that can't be disputed. And we need to emphasize moving past these anecdotal experiences that everybody wants to talk about. This time, I don't know if the slide is here. Yeah, it is here. 114 attendees. We overbooked the room. The representation across the board was pretty consistent with the stakeholders, EMS and public safety agencies, a lot of physicians. Our state, the subcommittee that I chair with the state EMSCC had just adopted the joint position statement as a state model best practice. So there was some energy around the fact that the state is now recognizing this model as meaningful. Many more presentations. Joni Harvey joined us from NISHDA and the 911 side of the DC group. Dr. Kramer, Dr. Fales, Dr. Daya, Dr. Kupas, and Dr. Bronsky, again, all presenting. A much more crowded room, very little room to sit or stand. We had a great presentation from the Haas group. They are the people that put the GPS devices on the ambulances and police cars and fire trucks, and it lights up everybody's ways when there's an emergency vehicle close by. They were a presenting sponsor. There was a lot of energy around that. But the agenda I've included for you here from the 3rd annual conference, and you can see kind of how we led the group in the discussion about what's happening, what the paper says, how dispatch can be a factor, systems that are actually making change. We talked about more systems nationally and starting a national paradigm shift around measurable metrics, patient outcomes, and not necessarily EMS response times. Dr. Kramer updated us on how things move in Washington, as well as how local physicians could take a lead in making some of these changes happen. Because the one thing we noticed at the 3rd conference is for all the time we were spending talking about what was happening in other EMS systems around the country, there was very little happening in our home state. And we wanted some of the take homes to be how to go back to your local system and either start the discussion or start the change. This meeting had more engagement from elected officials, again, concerned about risk, system development, building new stations, buying new vehicles, increasing personnel numbers, and the financial awareness of the topic had a much heavier presence in the 3rd summit than even in the 2nd. The emergency physicians in the room said, you know what, this data is getting more and more compelling. There are agencies across the country making very impressive changes. What are we waiting for here? The elected officials, like I said, were becoming aware of the financial impact. Staffing is tight here in Michigan. I'm sure it is nationally. But the elected officials are saying, we're paying more and more because we've got to hire more and more people and we've got to build more and more stations. And the reason we're doing it all is the concept of response time. And none of that is included in what the presenters are presenting as important metrics. And then my colleagues from the EMS world said, well, we know the study's there, we know the data's there, but it's the way we've always done it. The public expects it. They've got stories about this one time. And then there's this little pause from some of the more thoughtful EMS and public safety leaders. And I say this figuratively, but you can see them start to realize, hey, wait a minute. If we back down from this, everybody needs 6 minutes, everybody needs 3 or 4 pieces of apparatus. Maybe there's some of these calls that we're all not terribly happy to go on. Maybe we don't have to go on some of these calls now. And that was a very robust discussion that went on at the end of the actual session and afterwards and subsequent to that. Just in some of the communities that we've contracted with, I think 3 or 4 of them are now starting to pull back on some of the types of medical emergencies that their first responder units go on. Looking at response time exemptions in the contracts, it's interesting when I meet with them. We don't want to go on this, and this anymore. And I'm like, oh, okay. And by the way, we agree. But can we talk about the fact that you're still holding us to an 8-minute response time to a bunch of calls that you've now decided aren't emergencies anymore? That discussion really got started at the end of this meeting, and the feedback that I'm getting from around the state. There's actually there's several emails into me about starting a work group for agencies around the state, agencies and EMS systems that want to make these changes. And for the people who are engaged in the discussion now, they're kind of getting to the point where let's move forward on making these changes, but let's try to do them consistently across our systems here in Michigan so that we're all not, kind of shooting in the dark as we move forward on making these changes. So, I didn't want to get too far into all the data. I'm sure that everybody knows about the position papers that are out there. They're easily found on an AMSP website. I did include, and I will forward to Peter, a link. There's a YouTube series that recorded the safety summit from start to finish this time. And if you've got 8 hours, you can sit and watch it. Great comments from the physicians and the presenters. A little bit tough to hear some of the feedback from the room, but generally repeated by the presenters and a very, very engaging group. So, I still think we don't fully wrap our arms around the idea. We still love to tell people about our response times. We still talk about how loud the sirens are and 2 and 3 vehicles and all those things. But when emergency vehicles hit somebody in an intersection, or when we're struck, or we saw a tremendous accident in the last week or so with a response vehicle here in our country, racing to a scene. I've said this, and I've made myself stop saying it because I'm afraid of predicting the future. We're going to kill somebody on the way to a call where nobody was going to die anyway. And we've got to take ownership of that and stop fooling ourselves that what we've always been led to believe, it's not disingenuous that we believe this, but we're smarter than that now. We've got to own it. We've got to take responsibility for it. And in my opinion, we need to change the system design that many of us work in, and give props to the people that are doing it. I won't steal anybody's thunder, but we've got an EMS system in the country right now that I'm paraphrasing, and I'm paraphrasing with a little lean towards my preference here, but they've committed as a public unionized fire department, so it's not a private provider. Not that I think there's a system design difference, but in this example, it's a public provider. If you called their dispatch center with a identified priority 1 call, the highest level in the 2 EMD structures, you get an emergency response in 9 minutes or less. If it's below that criteria, they're going to be there sometime today. And if you don't like it, drive yourself to the hospital. And the patients are saying, well, fine, if you're not coming lights and siren, I'll drive myself to the hospital. And the agency's saying, good idea. See you there. And with no adverse outcome. So there are changes taking place. Some of us are pushing our systems forward. Some of us are engaging in ways that we try to understand what we can do and try to lead some changes. And there's some of us, I think, that are finding ways to hold our systems into this belief, because it's a belief that we've always held.
Wow. Well, Kolby, this is an amazing presentation. I know that many people are probably listening to this and they have a lot of thoughts in their head, and I want to open up a discussion about that. And I see that Dr. Daya is here. I would love to get your input, Mo, in a little bit as well. I will tell you from personal experience, and something that I don't really talk about, is that I almost lost my life responding to a call last year. And we were going to a call that did not need lights and sirens, did not need lights and sirens. We were going through an intersection. I saw the vehicle coming. The person that my EMS captain didn't, right? And I thought that they saw this car coming. We were blocked by an 18-wheeler. So her vision was blocked. I could see the car coming underneath. So I finally, at the very last second, I yelled, "Stop!" I screamed. And thankfully, she pumped the brakes just enough that the car completely totaled the front end of the car and didn't total me. So I totally get it. And by the way, we were going to an anaphylaxis call. The person did fine. Okay, so I think to your point exactly, things are happening every day. The situation you alluded to that happened in South Florida, that was an unfortunate thing. Again, to your point, I do want to bring in some folks here who have experience with this, and I will say that in South Florida, unfortunately, fortunately, whatever you want to say, we are an all ALS system. There's no tiered response. And therefore, using dispatch to, use determinants to figure out if it's if it's an alpha, omega, delta, echo, that's not being done at all, right? So you get a full-blown response every single time. And we get the same exact feedback every time we bring it up, which is, Doc, that's just how we've been doing it. So let me bring in. We have some very experienced people on this call. I see a lot of names that have been doing it for quite a long time. But let me bring in Dr. Mo Daya. Mo, your name has been mentioned several times by Kolby, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, and also if you're doing anything in your neck of the woods regarding this topic.
Well, you got me at the NAMSP conference, but yeah, I think that what we're trying to do is very hard is to create a tiered system and actually be more thoughtful. It means that dispatch has to spend a little bit more time, and separating lights and sirens and no lights and sirens is not always easy. But it means that dispatchers have to buy in with you, and they need to understand that sending something non-lights and sirens is not going to cause adverse outcomes. That's part of the buy-in, and with that, along with the fire departments, we have moved to a tiered system. And we're also moving much more to a non-lights and sirens response. But it's a transition. It takes some time. It doesn't happen overnight, and it requires you to get buy-in from all the stakeholders. But I agree fully with you. I think Kolby's, I'm really impressed with what's going on in Colorado Springs. So I'm not sure we're ready to move to that level of we'll come whenever we can type things. But I think we're slowly moving to that direction. The hard part is that I think the South Florida problem is the same problem we have. When I go on most of the calls, there's a large elderly population whose only access to care today seems to be through the 911 system. And so we got to figure out how we handle that. But yeah, it's work in progress. I think we've managed to get down to about 60-40. 60% code 3 or lights and sirens, 40% code 1. 50-50 on the ones that have determinants, but where you can pick one or the other. But the goal ultimately is to get more to 40-60, but that's the goal.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you for your comments, and I'll see you downstairs in a little bit. I'm going to bring in a few people, and I see David Long. So David is in the Tidewater region, EMS region, which is in Chesapeake area. He's a friend of the webinar and a friend in general. And David, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey, Doc, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
All right. So yeah, just we do run tiered response in Virginia overwhelmingly. Most of our agencies are combination departments, so you'll end up with fire apparatus response followed by EMS crews. Occasionally we have quick response vehicles, things of that nature. But I was really looking to see whether or not at the national level we're looking at we put such an emphasis on, getting our 911 centers through EMD, certification, thinking that it's a better way to handle the calls. And we're talking about our, the placement of the 911 call, the way that we, glean the information from that call, then dispatch appropriately, and et cetera. But linking essentially the EMD priority, to a lights and sirens response. So if this is truly a priority one call, I respond with lights and sirens. If it's anything less, I just don't. And whether or not things like that can be litigated to affect change. But I think what I put in after the fact is kind of what balances that, right? Is, people are so, I guess, concerned about litigation in this country, just because it's just the go-to for a lot of people, right? Is what impact then, or is there any existing case law, or any successfully litigated cases where they charge a response agency for not responding lights and sirens?
So we did a little bit of research here, and I will apologize for not having that collected, but if I can dig back through and find it, I'll send it to Peter and get it out to the gang. One of the things that we found is that the higher risk of litigation is an emergency response crash on the way to a call that by the national standards shouldn't have had an emergency response. So now that we're getting better around the country at our EMD process, we're starting to realize that, like Dr. Dias said, 60% of the calls don't need an emergency response. We're now sending multiple pieces of apparatus to these calls, lights and siren. And when they get into crashes, the litigation risk is higher, that you guys shouldn't have been around hot in the first place. And now my parents are dead or my family is dead. Somebody's got to justify the emergency response, recognizing that the dispatch information indicated at a national standard it wasn't an emergency at all. Some of the systems, they're turning 20% of the 911 calls over to a nurse navigator now. So,
That's right.
Wrap our heads around the fact that in some systems we're running lights and sirens to calls with ALS vehicles, where in a neighboring community, that patient's talking to a nurse on the phone and nobody's going.
Yeah. Great comments and great question. Okay, Lou, I know you probably have comments on this. You've been doing this for quite a while, former fire chief. You've done it all, you do it all. What are your thoughts?
I already wrote an article. So one, is the 9/11 report reliable or not? Years ago, I worked in dispatch and everyone had to be an EMT before we even had EMD. So we had a better sense of what was on the other side of it, which is important. Two, I think it's important that someone gets there in a reasonable amount of time. Come down to South Florida in the era of overdoses, and that minute or two might be the difference between cardiac arrest and respiratory arrest, a brain and no brain. Number three, there's a big training issue that gets ignored. We tend to give the new EMT the keys, point them in the right direction, say good luck. And now instead of learning where they're going, we distract them by looking at a terminal next to them. So they're not even fully paying attention to the road. That's a problem. Number four, we keep saying lights and siren equal to speed, racing to a scene. You just mentioned lights and siren has nothing to do with speed. It has to do with, from my house in the first mile, there's 2 traffic lights that are 2 minutes each. That could be 4 or 5 minutes just not waiting for 2 traffic lights. So that could be a big difference when we're talking about someone's brain. Again, not 4 vehicles going lights and siren, but someone, even a police car. The county I grew up in, every cop is trained as an EMT. If a cop who's an EMT gets there and says it's okay, we know it's okay. Number 5, because I've seen it in all those years, get out the door quick. How many people lollygag getting out there and then try and make up for it by rushing to a scene? It's absurd. And last, aggregated national data. Peter, you know what I'm talking about here. Does the aggregated national data apply to your city? And even when I do QI within a city, does it apply to this zone of your city? We've had presentations of counties that have urban, suburban, and rural areas, probably all different as far as response. Do you have traffic lights? Do you have highways? How are you responding? So there's a lot of factors involved here rather than just saying, well, lights and siren are bad. Now, one final note, 95% of transports should be without lights and sirens. Once we're there, we know, unless it's something we can't fix, like a stroke or a STEMI, excuse me, then they should not be. But in the era, again, of overdoses and whatnot, if we don't know for sure a reliable report, we need to get someone there to at least assess initially and say yes or no. That's it. Thanks.
And Lou, I think all of your comments rely on high quality dispatch, and understanding what the call is, right? In order for us to tease out which patient needs a BLS or an ALS, whether it's priority one, whether it's not, you have to have people who are able to determine that successfully. I think Jeff Jarvis put out a paper that showed only maybe 6% of patients needed what he called LSI, life-saving interventions. And then on the other hand, Jeff Williams, he should be coming on this webinar soon. I've tried to have him come on since last year. He talks about how there's a small percentage of calls that are determined to be alphas and omegas that end up not being alphas and omegas that do need life-saving intervention. So you have kind of both sides of the coin, and I think we're trying to figure out how to do it right every time and not get sued. And that's the big boogeyman that Kolby keeps talking about in the room, is that all someone has to say in the room is, but that one time when. And I think that's something that we need to think about. Let me bring in our friends from the north,
Peter,
our
can I
friends from
just make
Canada.
one
Oh yeah, yeah. Go ahead,
quick
Lou.
comment on that? Because again, we were EMTs with field experience. So one call, and I hate to give stories, but a catheter problem by an EMD became an alpha call. We got there, the patient was white as a sheet, good whole blood candidate. She had had a cardiac cath and was bleeding profusely into her groin. So the catheter problem just became at its word an alpha call, where it was really a different kind of catheter problem.
Sure,
So
sure. Right. No, I totally get it. Totally get it. Mike Humphrey, our friends from Lethbridge, Canada, soon to be the 51st state of America. Just kidding. Just kidding. Mike, tell us how
we can't
it
wait
is.
to be 51st.
I'm just messing with you. All right. So
No,
tell us
a lot of problems in healthcare and in EMS are really you're looking at a problem of omission versus commission, and this is what I see as we're more likely to make an error of omission than commission, and really you have to have your data based, or you have to have your response based on data, and then liability goes away. That's just my comment.
Well, and so I wonder, and Stein Bronski's not on the call, but if it is indeed Colorado Springs, and if it's not priority one, then we'll get there sometime today. And I think Stein's here at the conference. I'm gonna have to sidebar him, but I mean, we need information from systems like those, because I think once someone can kind of crack the code, because Kolby, I don't know if you mentioned, but you've had 3 summits, 3 years in a row. There are agencies doing things. Have those agencies published? This is to Adam's point, to Mike's point, and others' point. Have those agencies published on what they're doing? Do we know how Stein is doing in Colorado Springs? Do we know how others are doing around the country?
So there's a couple answers there. Stein's done a great job with some alternative response models too. So taking some of the patients, again, because of the dispatch information, all of their behavioral health patients are seen by these roving crews of providers who are specific to behavioral health patients. Their ambulance provider, AMR, I think in Colorado Springs, responds BLS trucks to certain dispatch criteria. I don't know about the publication of the follow-up data. I do know that I think it's Charlotte where Medic has lowered their non-emergency response time to 30 minutes. There have not been published or locally highlighted patient problems. There have been problems brought up by other public safety agencies saying, we're still going on these non-emergency calls. And when the patient's got a sprained ankle, we have to stand here with this patient with a sprained ankle for 20 minutes and wait for you guys to show up.
Interesting.
That's a different dialogue. That nobody claims that the sprained ankle is getting any worse. The claim is that we're standing here waiting for you to respond now that you're not coming in 9 minutes for all of these calls.
Right. Interesting.
And again, I think in those systems, and Matt has this data, and Dr. Krupas has got a world of data on this. For the time-sensitive patients who are identified through the dispatch process, Now the ALS vehicle is still in service because they're not tied up on a behavioral health emergency or a sprained ankle. So
Mhm.
we're not discounting or dismissing the fact that there are a small number of patients who need timely response. We're trying to, target our responses to the people who need it, the patients who need it, and at the same time reduce how we respond to everybody else. It's interesting to me in Southeast Michigan, and we work with a variety of fire departments and a variety of models of fire departments. So not every, you've seen one fire department in Michigan, you've seen one fire department. If somebody calls and says, there's a dumpster on fire in the empty parking lot next to my house, they will send a utility truck, non-emergency, with a couple guys thinking it's going to be out when they get there. If somebody calls and says, there's somebody laying next to the dumpster in the parking lot next to my house, and I think I saw him walking through the parking lot with a bottle of beer, we send an ALS ambulance, an ALS engine, a fly car, and a couple police cars because he might be having a cardiac arrest. So we treat dispatch information by agency and by structure and by department and by municipality differently in how we respond, whether it's a medical or a fire or law enforcement situation. And again, I don't want to go to one of my providers' family members and tell them that their family member, the MedStar employee, or anybody else in our system has been injured or killed responding to a call that every indication that we had, much like your example, every indication that we had didn't require
Mhm.
an emergency response. We've got emergency contracts that require my organization and similar organizations in Michigan. We're a big not-for-profit. We're owned by two of the biggest health systems in Michigan. We've got response contracts that require us to respond, lights and siren, to patients where the local fire department is a first response ALS system with an average of 4 or 5 minute response times. And I say to the chief and to the elected officials, how many paramedics need to be on scene before it's not an emergency anymore? And we scratch our heads.
Right.
We scratch our heads. So a lot of good discussion around the country, a lot of good data, and I think a lot of good data. Dr. Bronsky, I'm sure has some. Dr. Krupas, I'm sure has a lot. Where, and Krupas said at the third summit, if you are measuring the quality of your system, response time will not be a metric that changes the quality outcomes in your system. And his
Yeah.
research proves that out. So there's a lot of it out there. Now, as we keep going forward, I think to your point, we need to do better now about collecting the data on the systems that are making the changes, because that'll make the rest of us feel better about advocating for them in our communities.
Great comment. And I'm going to bring in Gordon for a comment here, but I will say that Doug takes over as NEMSP president on Saturday, tomorrow. So he's got the bully pulpit. If this is an issue that he cares about, which sounds like he does, then maybe he can really start to move. Because I really don't think, Kolby, that the locals will move unless there's some mandate or something has to happen at a higher level statewide, because I just feel like every fire chief doesn't want to start to fight the fight. And they say, listen, it's in the man. I have a 8 minute response time. I have to abide by that. That's what they're paying us to do. So things have to change structurally before people can, I think, wrap their arms around this. And that's why I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes. But Gordon, let me bring you in. So Gordon's from DeSoto Parish EMS, which is in Louisiana. Any comments here? Are you using a system here um, that is abiding by the current standard, or are you doing anything differently?
This time, as far as once we get on scene, of course, we make that determination, license sirens. But this is one of those things that I think that's, falls in that category. We've always done it this way. This is eye-opening to me. I'm always focused on the, high speed, low drag things. Hey, I'm laser focused on medical stuff, and I don't, really think about things like this. And I really appreciate it, Kolby, for you doing all this information and data gathering. It's something that's, we always look at these glorious things and say, oh, wow, look at this. We put these ventilators or blood or something like that. When every life saved doesn't matter. Our lives, patient lives, bystanders' lives. It all matters. This has been very eye-opening and informative to me. And it's going to be one of those things that I kind of push up the ladder and say, hey, we need to look at this. There's no point light sirens for a toe pain or ear pain or tooth pain. And we all have those. In my experience too, dispatch, when they dispatch us, at least our dispatch, it usually sounds a lot more serious than it is. I cannot tell you how many times I get called altered LOC. Well, I'm self-assigned as a supervisor. I self-assign myself to all calls. So 50% altered LOC. And when we get there, we're like, where did this come from? We usually never get there. And it's like, oh, wow, this is very surprising. This is a lot worse than when dispatch said. It's usually, downplayed a lot. So great information, though. This is definitely something to focus on, I think, with everybody.
Yeah, great comment. Thanks for your comment. And I think we all need to look at our systems individually, and start to evaluate response times and to start to unlink it from quality, because I do agree with that comment that you said, Dr. Kramer made. This is almost also akin to me to the backboards, where it took many people many years to get rid of the backboards. They're not people pushing to get rid of C collars, right? Chris Caldwell had a good talk here yesterday at NMSP, saying that those collars are not coming off, even though there's zero data to show that those collars are working. So why do we continue to do things? And Kolby, you mentioned that there are different reasons why people want to continue doing things, but for the thing that they really hate, they'll take those off right away. But for some reason, this is one of those sticky ones. So, but I think we're good there. And if anybody else wants to make a comment, Andrew, thanks for making your comments in the chat. I'll give you a minute. You want to make any other comments?
Peter, I have one
here
last.
Publicly. Oh yeah,
I have one last comment to add. There's been a lot of talk of, in all the summits and even some of the conversations today, there is this public expectation, the elephant in the room, if you will, the public expectation. My belief is, and part of the reason that I'm taking it as a personal objective, I've probably got 10 years left in the career, God willing, and I'll put all of that good time in. But that the public expectation is built by us. We've contributed to the Rescue 911 shows. We've contributed to all the public discussion around this. If we truly believe what the data shows from around the country, and the data, I've heard Dr. Krupa say, and I believe it, the data against response time as a clinical outcome driver is stronger than the data that we use to get rid of backboards. So the data is there. If we truly believe that, we need to take ownership that the public trusts us and the public expectation will follow our presentation. We can't let Mr. Fletcher demand how our EMS systems are built based on what he's seen on TV. We've got to be advocates for system change, all system change, and this is a difficult one for sure.
I never thought about the fact that there's so many shows on today, and there's new ones coming out, Doc and Pit Med and Chicago Fire, and and all those are portraying this the other side of reality kind of thing, right? And I wonder, and if you read Malcolm Gladwell's recent book, Revenge of the Tipping Point, he talks about how once something gets into the public realm, specifically in media, TV, movies, you're toast. Like you're battling, the TikToks, and you're battling what the common layperson may feel to be true, and it's an uphill battle if we're just sitting in meetings talking about it. So it's a fascinating psychological thing, and that's why I love that you had your elected officials and so forth in the room, because those are the people who ultimately have to make the change to allow us to make our change, right? So, and then Andrew, did you want to? You make some comments in the chat. Are you there? You want to make any final comments?
Yeah, just again, it's anecdotal, but there was one evening I was out in my town and saw an ambulance, lights and siren, rushing to the hospital, followed by a fire truck with a single driver, lights and siren following, followed by another fire vehicle with a single driver, lights and siren following. Come to find out, the ambulance was transporting a 90-year-old person in asystole. And so 3 vehicles, lights and siren through a busy community to take a dead person to the hospital. We have to change the mindset of our communities.
Wow. Yeah. How many times have you gotten questions from your friends and you say, why are those fire engines coming through the community? Is there fire here? Like nobody in my community understands why my agency's fire engines are zooming through the little communities and everyone's looking for smoke. Like no one really gets what's really going on here. So anyway, Kolby, give us the last word. If you're talking to someone out there, a lot of people are going to watch this on YouTube and they're thinking, where the hell do I start? Like where do you recommend someone out there, fire chief, EMS chief, someone starts? Like what's step number 1? And then we'll end it there.
I've got a real strong deference to Doug Kupis and the research that he's done in the lights and siren risks and now the clinical impact of response time on outcomes. Just read the data. And it's not high-level clinical data. It's common sense data. Get through our own biases to what we've all been raised on. I understand. I got into this business from Johnny and Roy, and maybe not everybody on the call gets it, but they never went on a non-emergency response, that's for sure. But setting aside what we've all learned and all the time we spent in EMT class working on backboards, we've got to put the same attention into this so that we don't have injury or death to a provider, a member of the public, or a patient for us chasing a metric that we all know doesn't matter. Start with the data and then look at our biases and we'll move this thing forward.
Thank you. Great comment and great response. Thank you for leading the charge. I know it takes a lot to do these things, set up summits, bring people in, get the vendors, feed everybody, do the whole thing. But clearly this is a mission of yours. And I think with Doug in the position that he's in, hopefully, and I'll try to get him on this webinar to see if he can actually go through some of that data so more people can get exposed to it. But with that, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the webinar. I'm going to put it up on the YouTube channel. And then if you can send me anything that I can link so people can actually see those things, I'd be very appreciative. But Kolby, thank you so much. And have a great rest of the week. All right. Thanks everybody.
Have a great week.
You got it. It's 2. And there's no Paul Pepe webinar today. So you guys are